the Hudson Library and Historical Society presents the 2018 Author Series, featuring Ohio author D.M. Pulley, speaking about her new book, The Unclaimed Victim, a new novel about the dark and frightening history of the 1930s Cleveland torso murders, which follows her two previous books, The Dead Key, winner of the 2015 Amazon Breakthrough Novel Award, and 2016's The Buried Book. Recorded at the Hudson Library's Flood Meeting Room on April 18, 2018.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Hudson Library and Historical Society. My name is Amanda Flower, and I'm one of the reference librarians here, and it's my distinct pleasure to introduce my friend and also best-selling author, D.M. Pulley, to you. D.M. will be speaking this evening on her new novel, The Unclaimed Victim. Before becoming a full-time writer, Pulley worked as a professional engineer rehabbing historic structures and conducting forensic investigations of building failures. Pulley's structural survey of the vacant building in Cleveland inspired her debut novel, The Dead Key, the winner of the 2014 Amazon Breakthrough Novel Award. She's also the author of two other novels, The Buried Book and The Unclaimed Victim. Please join me in welcoming D.M.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you all for coming out to hear a little bit about my work. It's a great pleasure to be back here in Hudson. This crowd was so welcoming and wonderful to me a couple years ago. My first book came out, so I'm really happy to be back. And I'm really happy that the Learned Owl is here. Kate, whose shop is just up the way, is selling books in the back, and I'll be happy to talk with you one-on-one after the show. But I want to tell you a little bit about me. For those of you who don't know, my first novel, The Dead Key, came out in 2015, and it was based on my personal work in an abandoned building, as Amanda had said. It was only published because I won a contest, and 10,000 books, seriously, it was going to rot in my drawer. 10,000 books were entered back in 2014 in the Amazon Breakthrough Novel Award worldwide, and for some reason this book won the grand prize. So I am quite honored to be here, and I'm thrilled to say that the success of this book has allowed me to become a full-time writer. So in the past couple of years, I've been very busy. In 2016, my second novel came out, and this was inspired by a family mystery. And my latest novel just came out this past November, The Unclaimed Victim. And I've gotten a chance to talk to readers quite a bit in Northeast Ohio in the past few years. And what I find more interesting to you and to me, rather than trying to do a reading or something dry like that, I like to talk about where the book came from and what my inspiration was and how I got to writing this story and how it kind of evolved. There will be time at the end for questions for those of you who have read it or want to know more about certain things. But this story begins in 1999. How many people remember 99? It's kind of fuzzy in my memory. I was about 23, and I was living in Tremont. I had just graduated college. I was just starting out as an engineer. As you can see there, I was a really, professional, well-put-together lady. Nothing to do at all with Iris Latch, nothing. No drinking, no bad behavior. No, I was just starting out, and I just moved to Tremont, which back then, Michael Simon's restaurant, Lola, had been open for a while. It wasn't like the burgeoning of that neighborhood, but it was still kind of on the cusp, and I was definitely a tree monster. I was a yuppie. I was there for cocktails and art galleries and good restaurants. And in 99, I don't know if you guys remember, it was kind of a tense time. Do you remember the New Year Millennium Crisis, Y2K? There were a lot of people who thought the world might be coming to an end. And I thought that was kind of an interesting time. You're kind of like on the verge of a precipice. So part of the story of The Unclaimed Victim takes part in 99 in Tremont. Chris Wiley is a young woman. She's still in college, but she's renting a bungalow in Tremont. on Thurman Avenue. And the reason why I picked Thurman Avenue, I did not live on Thurman, but I lived a couple blocks away, and it's still there. It doesn't quite resemble what it used to. You used to walk down this street. Now there's like new condos and things and row houses, but it used to be like weird broken garden gnomes and bumper stickers on the houses and like weird like half broken whirligigs and like a Stephen King ghost like living around the corner. Like this whole street was just blocks and blocks of fun oddities, and I used to love walking down it. I loved how the doorsteps kind of opened into the gutter. I loved how that's the kind of thing I like. I loved how it was all kind of like early Eastern European bungalow, like working class folks that populated Tremont. They immigrated to Cleveland to work in the steel mills, to work in the factories, and a lot of these immigrants settled in Tremont. So Thurman Avenue is kind of like a little row of wonders. And smack dab in the middle of this weird one-way road is this old abandoned factory. It was abandoned in '99, so this is one view of it. So you're just walking around, little house, and then giant block-sized behemoth. Here's another view. I love how this door is like 3 steps, gutter, and then giant abandoned factory. This is where Chris Wiley is living in the story. And this is another view. So, you know, on Thurman Avenue, it's like, oh, abandoned factory. And then you take a step away and you realize that this is a giant, enormous albatross of a building. I'm going to give you a little tour on the outside because this building was my muse for the Unclaimed Victim. It's really where the whole story started and what inspired me to try to write a mystery, because walking around this place, it's not one building, it's 15. It was built over the course from Civil War times to the 1940s. Every time they got money together or the ownership changed, they might build on an addition. So this is part of the factory, so is this, so is that, so is that. So yes, these buildings are conjoined, like bizarre twins. I actually lived in I lived in an apartment that spanned across this divide. It was bizarre when I was working on the book. Here's another view, same complex. You have, this is Jefferson Avenue, this is West 7th Street. If you're a person just standing here, you cannot see into this little grassy knoll, kind of, you know, human zoo situation they've got. You've got this sort of Gothic revival, you've got industrial. This is the view from the sidewalk. You can't really see what's going on. You just see spires and bizarreness. And when it was vacant in '99, you would see candles burning in some of the windows. Even though it was officially not occupied, there were some people living inside the building, and that fascinated me. I wanted to know who these people were. So this is the view of part of the complex from West 7th Street. So this is now known as the Tremont Lofts. But when I was living in Tremont back in '99, this was the old Union Gospel Press building. And it was legendary. It was a place where where they printed Bibles. It was an artist commune for a while. And if you peeked in, you would see details like this one, this custom handmade door. That was made by Joe Scully and some of the artisans he had living there. You could peek into the courtyard and see like bizarre, witchy, crafty looking things like this, like just sort of sitting there in one of the little loading dock areas. So I became obsessed with this building. And over the years, just on my own time, for my own interest, I started to try to put together a history of this building because I wanted to know, first of all, what the heck were the builders thinking? Like, who would build a building like this? And I wanted to know who was living there when I saw the candles, and I wanted to know about the Bible factory. I wanted to know everything. So it turns out Cleveland University was originally the owner of that site. And most people don't know we had a Cleveland University. We had it for 2 whole years. And that's why Tremont has streets named College, University, Professor. If you ever wonder why, it's because there was supposed to be this great university in Tremont. It only lasted 2 years because they hired a hippie from Oberlin to be the chancellor of this university. And he had crazy ideas like, let's let African Americans come and let's educate women. And Pelton, Widow Pelton, was the benefactor of the university. And when she passed away, all the funding fell away. No one wanted to support this crazy notion of equality. And so the university failed, and the property was sold. And it was used for various different things. They think it was part of the Humiston Institute. It was a little prep school for a while. They do believe it was a Civil War hospital and convalescence home for part of its life. They turned it into a homeopathic hospital college. But the most interesting part of its history is here, in my opinion. In 1907, a Reverend Musselman came from Lancaster, Pennsylvania to Cleveland. He was a Mennonite. He came with a cloister of nuns. Basically, they're not Catholic nuns, but they were Mennonite women, to be missionaries here in Cleveland. And their goal was to save the souls of the city dwellers, which I think is fascinating. They bought this old complex in Cleveland, in Tremont, where there are more churches per capita than anywhere else in the nation, from what I've heard. I mean, you can't like walk 2 feet without hitting a church in Tremont. But they decided that they were going to really save the souls of the working poor in Cleveland, and they ran Bible schools for children in Public Square. They did all kinds of great things. So when finally Reverend Musselman died, his daughter took over. They built a new facility in Brook Park, and they're still there. So they moved out of the complex. These are the people that built on these 15 buildings. I think there was 2 when they bought the property, and every time they gathered enough money, they kept constructing. So I was fascinated with that portion of the history. After they sold, the building was never fully occupied again. It was a part-time Bible factory for the Diocese of Cleveland. It was a flop house for a while. They tried to use it as a boarding house. Joe Scully, this eccentric ex-boxer welder guy, buys the complex in 1987. Tremont in 87 was a little scary. He was able to purchase 178,000 square feet of industrial space for $78,000. So he bought this old albatross of a building for a song and wanted to turn it into an artist commune. And he spent several decades like trying to customize the space, renting it out to artists, having feuds with the city. Some say the building drove him insane. When Tremont started to really come back and thrive as an artist community, as a restaurant hotspot, they tried to buy the building from him over and over and over again, and he notoriously wouldn't sell until finally in 2003 he sold it for $1.4 million. So I guess the joke's on everybody else that he walked away with all this cash. Unfortunately, Joe did pass away last year, but I got a chance to speak with his family as I was researching. So the building finally sold. It took 6 years to renovate, and it opened as the Tremont Place Lofts in 2009. So when I was interested in the building, it was right around the time Joe Scully was giving up, and it was right around the time that the flop house, the commune had folded, and it had just really fallen into disrepair. So the most interesting part of the building's history to me was when the union workers, the Gospel Worker Society, was there. This is Reverend Musselman. This is from their own newsletter. These were the original missionary women that came with him. Now, they got excommunicated, in a way, from the Mennonite Brethren because they weren't following the rules. Some of the more old-fashioned Mennonite Brethren felt it was wrong to let women go out into the city and talk to people. They thought it was dangerous. They thought it was inappropriate. So they became Unitarians over time. But when they were living in Tremont, they called them the Sallies because they were all dressed the same as Mennonite women would do once they kind of took over plain dress. But they would sing sometimes from the balconies of the Gospel Press building, and they say that at night you can hear them singing from the upper floors. That's one of the legends of the building. But I found these women fascinating. At the height of the mission, there were over 200 women living behind those walls, some of which never left the complex. And I was kind of fascinated by that. So after the building sold, they did a bunch of stories on it around Halloween. You know, we love our haunted house stories. And I had picked up this article years ago about how they brought in a psychic into the building after it was sold. And she goes through, and you go on a tour with her in this article. It's a great little piece about there being an 8-year-old girl trapped somewhere in the basement. Some Civil War soldiers' ghosts were around. I just kind of found it fascinating. And the maintenance people today will tell you the place is haunted, and if they're alone and walking down a hall, that doors will close or there'll be footsteps behind them. So there was sort of this mystique to the building that it was haunted. Finally I got to go inside, and I actually rented an apartment for 2 weeks, and I got to live inside. So I'm gonna give you a little inside tour of my muse. This is a view from one of the upper floors. This building was filled with nooks and crannies and bizarre courtyards. This was all built before air conditioning, so every room had to have an outdoor window. And when you're taking up the whole city block, you have to have lots of light wells so that you can have windows for interior rooms. So there are over 30 different light wells in this complex. Every time you look out a window, you're like, wait, where am I? Like, there are creepy, narrow, bizarre spaces. I just love how sinister this feels. You can actually walk through here and like peek down. Doesn't that look like some sinister mustache twisting evil person might be like living up there? This is one of the bizarre nondescript little light wells that just let in a little bit of air and light into the building. Everywhere you turn, I got lost for the first 2 days. There are also over 15 different stairwells in the building. And as you're going through, when you go from one building construction phase to another, sometimes there's a big step down in the floor, or you'll see a window that used to be an outside window, now is just in the middle of a hallway because they just decided to add on without making many changes. So I'm going to try to give you a little tour of some of the oddities of this place. I love this door. This door actually appears in the book, The Hobbit door, because you can see here's the floor, there's the doorknob. This is the sort of addition that they would build. They're like, oh, well, there's a door there. Who cares? We're just going to put the floor right there and just leave the door in place. And I just love that. I also love how spooky now. When I was walking in '99 as a young woman, I would peer in through this loading dock and see these bizarre little stairwells. They'd be like dead plants. A black cat would skitter across. There were so many interesting little facets to this house, to this building. I could picture the 200 Mennonite women walking single file down these super narrow outdoor corridors. I love this door. In case you need to kill somebody, it's great to have a door that just opens into a death drop, don't you think? This is the kind of thing that this building is filled with. I love this door. So this is an apartment entrance. We were able to go inside. This is actually like a chimney chase. That's my cousin. This door was just a blank door, not chained, not locked, but we were able to drag a chair over and open it, and yeah, there's stairs inside, up through a blind chimney chase. So how fun is this, right? It's like a haunted house with trap doors and secret passageways. Who's not happy? I love that stuff. This is another great door. The stair landing is like all the way down here. That door was about to hear on me when I was walking through the building. So you can see the kind of care and forethought they took when they were building on an addition. And of course, you've got your dark, spooky, just creepy little crevices. On the interior, I was not able to see all the inside spaces. This is an old photograph before the renovation that I got from Cleveland Real History. But I love, and here's a view from cleveland.com. This room, this gallery, is one of the settings of the book inside the building, because I just thought that was beautiful. It's Jimmy's apartment, if you've read the book. This was one of my favorites. So this is an old historical picture of a door up high in the wall. I actually stayed in this apartment for a week and dragged a chair over and climbed inside, and this is what was inside. Just a very narrow, the staircase was about 22 inches wide, very steep metal stairs going up through a chimney. And they actually took me out onto the roof. So yeah, so this is the view from the rooftop up there. So I had a lot of fun running around this building. And what it really reminded me of was Devil in the White City. Those of you familiar with this story? For those of you who are not, Eric Larson did a beautiful job marrying crime and architecture in the book, this book. It's based on a true crime story. H.H. Holmes, at the turn of the century, was America's, I think he's given the credit of being America's first serial killer. He built a death trap hotel in Chicago. He designed it to trap and kill women. And he hired his architects and his contractors in such a way that he kept firing and bringing in new people, so nobody had a complete set of plans and nobody knew what he was up to. And so he had secret entrances and chutes down into the basement where the boilers were and these ovens. And he would trap these young women who'd come up from the countryside to work the World's Fair in Chicago. He would let them stay in his rooming house, and then he would find ways to kill them. He actually sold their skeletons for money. That was one of the ways he got, rid of the bodies, was he actually sold them because medical schools needed specimens. So this was a very chilling book. It was a very interesting look. And for someone like me, I'm an engineer who loves old buildings, I love the idea that the building itself was sinister. The building itself had a role to play in these crimes. And so when I look at the Union Gospel Press building, this old building, it looks like a great place to commit a murder. I was like, I love the history of it. I wanted to know about those women that lived inside. I have a character that's a missionary woman who tries to help my prostitute, Ethel Harding, find safety. She's living on the streets. There's a killer on the loose. And so she gets to infiltrate. Oh my God, it was so fun to bring a prostitute into a convent. It was a really, really fun setup. But I wanted to know more about these women. I wanted to know more about the building, and I definitely wanted there to be a killer. And I like writing historical fiction because I like the idea of using fiction to explain the unexplained, to give a name and face to a killer that's at this point not known. So I started looking for a killer operating in Cleveland around the 1930s. I did not know about the torso killer until I started looking for a killer. And so what I love to do when I'm researching is they've scanned in to the Cuyahoga County database every plain dealer newspaper from 1845 to 1991. And you can do a keyword search. So you search for murder in a certain time period, like murder 1934. And every murder that's reported in the paper will come up. So that's kind of one of the ways I started my research. And the one thing that kept coming up over and over again were the torso killings. This was the news report from victims 1 and 2. Eddie Andrassy was one of the few of all the victims of the torso killer. And for those of you who are not familiar, this was a killer operating between 1934 and 1938. There are, depending on who you ask, the Cleveland Press believed there were 13 victims of this same killer. The Cleveland Plain Dealer to this day will only attribute 12. When they interviewed me this past fall, they said 12, 12 victims. They do not count victim 0. So between these 4 years, 13 bodies showed up that many attributed to the same killer. And it was sensational, not just because it was murder. I mean, we're talking the 1930s in Cleveland. The mob was killing people all the time. More people were dying in traffic accidents every day than this killer killed at all. But what really captured people's imaginations and terrified them was the nature of the killings. They were very gruesome. These bodies were beheaded, often dismembered at every major joint. Some body parts were never found. This killer killed vagrants, prostitutes, hobos, people that nobody would miss. And it was, again, one of the very earliest cases of a serial killer operating in our country. The word serial killer didn't even exist back then. That word did not get invented until about the 1970s when the FBI started studying these psychopaths. But back then in the 30s, they were confronted with this killer that attacked strangers, and they were not able to ever identify who this killer was. So I started doing my research on the torso killer, and it was daunting. As you can see from this picture, it was a gruesome series of crimes. This was the extent of desecration of the bodies that happened in some instances. The first book I read on the subject was Jim Bedell's In the Wake of the Butcher, and this is a nonfiction account of the killings. There's been a lot of books written on this killer, as I was kind of dismayed to find out. Because when you're trying to write something fresh and new from a new perspective, it's a little scary to deal with something that's been studied so extensively. But I kind of felt myself getting sucked into this rabbit hole, even though I didn't quite want to go. I was very nervous to write about a serial killer that was famous in Cleveland and across the country in certain circles. From that book and bibliography and talking to people, I also read all of these books on the subject. Stephen Nichols is also a nonfiction. My favorite resource in my research was this book by John Bartlow Martin. It was written in the 40s, and it was written in the voice of Sam Spade. You can see his fedora and hear him smoking as he's telling the story of what the hobo jungles were like and what the conditions in Cleveland were like while this killer was marauding and terrorizing the public. So the deeper I got into my research, the more convinced I became that they had missed something. And of course, that's how these cases hook you and destroy your life. Like if you could really Peter Merlo, one of the lead detectives on the case, it drove him kind of mad. He worked on it through his retirement. He believed there were over 50 victims. He would dress up as a hobo and ride the rails, trying to be a victim and trying to catch this guy undercover. You can really spend your whole life going down deeper into the details. But I did have this nagging feeling as I went to the county archives and I looked through all the records I could get my hands on without spending 10 years. I mean, Jim Bedell has written 4 books on the subject. He's actually a friend of mine, and he spent years and years researching it. But it kind of stuck in my craw. And the number one thing that bothered me about Bedell's theory of Dr. Francis Sweeney being the killer was the fact that everything hinged on the opinion of one man, which was Coroner Gerber. Coroner Gerber was the only opinion that mattered when it came to deciding this body. There were a bunch of victims in Pennsylvania that got ruled out because in Coroner Gerber's opinion, the method of killing was different and they were ruled out. There was some disputes between Coroner Gerber and, say, Case Western School of Medicine. They had disputes on time of death and they wanted to check his findings, and he would sometimes withhold the evidence from someone else's opinion. Coroner Gerber was our county coroner for 50 years, and I'm not trying to disparage his work, but I thought it was interesting that if you take away his opinion from the facts and you look at things, sort of put that aside and just look at the evidence, I got the strong sense that there was more than one killer. And I got the strong sense that the police were definitely looking in the wrong places because they didn't understand the nature of these types of crimes. They were looking for sex maniacs. They were looking at homosexuals because they believed them to be mentally ill. They were looking for people who looked crazy. And they didn't really have a concept like we do today that a killer could be a married person with children and a very productive member of the community, and all the neighbors would say, oh, he was the nicest guy. That whole concept didn't really exist back then. So as I kind of got deeper into my research, the other thing that stood out to me was that the stories, the novels, all the things I'd read really focused on the investigators, on the police officers, on the detectives, or Elliot Ness, who was involved in this whole thing. He actually was so desperate to catch the killer, he kidnapped a guy and held him against his will for several days in the Renaissance Hotel. And many people believe, and Jim Bedell believes, that person, that mystery suspect, was Dr. Francis Sweeney. And Dr. Francis Sweeney, to his credit, was a doctor. They thought that the killer must be a doctor because of the way the bodies were handled and cut. He was also an alcoholic. He also spent most of his time in mental institutions. So he looked good for the crime. But if you look at the way the work was done, the victims 1 and 2 were found on Jackass Hill in Kingsbury Run, which is where the RTA goes into Shaker Heights, where I live. It's right there around East 55th to East 79th Street. That's where a lot of the bodies were found. If you go in there, I'm trying to get my head wrapped around what I was going to say with that. I was on a roll. I did. My train of thought just ran away with me. If you look at, let's just keep moving for a second. We'll see if that comes back. I was going somewhere. I loved the, Dr. Sweeney. Yeah, what was I saying about him? The first 2 victims on Jackass Hill. The reason why, thank you. Gosh, I need you guys to follow me around and help me. This is what happens when you turn 42. Victims 1 and 2, Eddie Andrassy and the unidentified man, were only decapitated. So they were large grown men bodies that were carried down a steep hill, not dragged because there was no sign of dragging. They were nude, and they were huge guys. The idea of one man carrying these dead weight, full-grown men down this hill without dragging the bodies and then putting them on display. Those 2 killings, the first victims 1 and 2, really stuck in my craw because it was such a public statement. I mean, 2 kids found these bodies. They were laid out almost biblically, like with, the heads missing. They were emasculated. The heads were found nearby. It seemed like a strong message, and it was very deliberate. Whereas some of the other victims were cut up into little pieces and kind of just thrown in the river, almost as if the killer hoped that the bodies wouldn't be found. And I thought it was interesting that the MO seemed so very different. And I take this picture just to show you how carefully they protected the crime scene back in the 1930s. Do you see that little kid? I actually met a very nice lady at the Music Box Supper Club who lived next to Jackass Hill, and her backyard fence backed up to the spot where they found the bodies, and she remembered the cops being down there trying to do their evidence collection and wanting to go down to look and see. It was fascinating the way this was handled in such a public way. The public was all over these sites. They didn't cordon off anything. And there was no good collection of evidence because so many people were tromping in and out. This was one of the victims. One of the things that broke my heart studying this case was the fact that of the 13, broadly accepted victims of the killer, only 3 were ever identified. And victim number 8 was only tentatively identified as Rose Wallace because Coroner Gerber disagreed on the time of death with when she disappeared. It was off by, I think, like 7 weeks. And if you talk to medical examiners today, her body was found decomposed in lime and just bones. And to be that careful or that specific about the time of death, they'd be hesitant to do that today. So Rose Wallace, I kind of attribute victim 8 as being Rose Wallace in the book because a lot of people believe that was the case. The dental records matched. But the other 10, nobody has any idea. This death mask was put on display during our exposition, our lake exposition, for over 100,000 people. Children, adults walked past. They were trying to get somebody to identify who this person was, and they never could. I love the historical photographs just to kind of show you the conditions people were living in. At the time this killer was operating, this is a shanty town. I believe this is down by the river, but there were 2 hobo jungles in Cleveland in the Great Depression. One was in Kingsbury Run, which is a dry creek bed where we have train tracks now, and there were train tracks then. And the other one was down by the Cuyahoga River near the flats. And unfortunately, 1 in 4 Clevelanders was unemployed at the height of the Great Depression. Children were living in these conditions. It wasn't just drunks and bums. It was dispossessed families, orphans. One of the good things Elliot Ness did while he was here in Cleveland was start Boys Town because there were so many homeless orphan boys running through the streets picking people's pockets. Here's another victim that they never identified. Very young. And here's Sideaway Bridge, which was a fun field trip to go find. Because it's still there, but it's overgrown with weeds and vines, and there's an apartment. Like, you have to kind of climb up on the roof of your car with a camera. Not that I did that, but yeah. It's, this is one of the bridges that goes over Kingsbury Run where they were looking for evidence. In my research, I rely a lot on historical photographs to give me a sense of the people's dress, the way they were kind of gathered around. These are workers working on some of the sewers. I mean, Kingsbury Run was a riverbed till they diverted the water. And Wadsworth was a sewer bed that they eventually closed up. There was a lot of public works projects going on then. So I read through all the newspaper articles, which I found helpful. This was another part of Kingsbury Run. That's the Sideaway Bridge where they drained rivers and creek beds. This is Kingsbury Run today. So you can go to the East 79th Street RTA rapid stop and just go down the long steps and stand there and feel the wind blow past all the ghosts. Because there were about 6 bodies found along these train lines. And it was wooded and there's still debris. It's kind of reminiscent today of what it was like. More bodies were found in the Cuyahoga River. There was some evidence that maybe a car had stopped and dropped sacks over it. People would see things, but there was never enough evidence to really investigate what was going on. But there was a green, fancy sedan involved and cited at points where bodies were found, which I found interesting. So I like to think about this as where Ethel Harding was camped out. This is where some of the hobo jungles were. People were sleeping on these banks of the river. One of my favorite characters in the book comes from Bartlow Martin's book, Ricky, Gin Ricky. There was a transvestite gentleman, a large, they thought he was Armenian gentleman living under the Lorraine Carnegie Bridge. And this is the abutment by the West Side Market, and we're down below. Looking there at the abutment, there's actually a little room space. And they could never catch this guy, but he was rumored to be very tall, and he collected over 200 women's shoes. And they were convinced that he must be a killer, because where else would he get 200 shoes? And so I love that there were people kind of living in and around the bridges. And someone, before the show started, mentioned the Superior Viaduct Bridge as being a good site for a story. I loved, taking the story up inside this little cavern where Ricky was staying. And this picture, this is Flo Polillo, victim number 3. She really was the inspiration for a lot of what I did. When I was reading through, the one piece I felt was missing was that the story of the victims had never really been told. When we read murder mysteries, we tend to focus on the investigative side of how do you find the killer and what are the techniques and the forensics and everything else. And I was fascinated by these people, these mysterious, never identified street people kind of living below the city in these shanty towns. They were able to link victim number 1, Eddie Andrassy, Flo, victim number 3, and Rose Wallace. They all went to the same bar. And it was over on Central Avenue, near downtown. And the cops would just frequent there, in disguise or whatever, trying to see. They figured the killer must go to that bar too, because there had to be some connection between all these victims. That was one of the things the cops believed strongly. And when you're investigating a murder, you're usually looking for people who knew the victims. Like, once you identify the victim, 9 times out of 10, the killer is somebody that person knew. So they were desperately trying to identify these people and link them together. But what I found fascinating, victims 1, 3, and 8, so Flo here, Eddie, who was like a pimp and a hustler, and Rose, who was also a known prostitute, were all hanging out at this bar. And I wanted to connect them, but I wanted to connect them in a human way. Like, who else knew them? Who were their friends? Somebody knew something. And if you think about it, they did over 1,000 interviews of cranks, of witnesses, of people who claimed to know something. But the folks that were most affected by this, hobos, prostitutes, people who were homeless, would they trust police officers? Would they really be 100% truthful? You have to remember, in the 1930s, the mob actually owned a lot of the police force. That's one of the things that Elliot Ness came in as safety director to try to reform. And he was largely successful. But I don't think he came in till 35 or 6, and the killings had already begun. So there was this sense that, the police force maybe weren't completely trusted. If you are living in the underworld and you're living a vice type existence, you're doing a black market type commerce, are you really going to talk to the cops about everything you know? I really wanted to know more about the people who may know the answer to this big mystery. Like, there's probably people that knew who the killer was, but they were either didn't come forward, or maybe they solved the crime using their own means. I was kind of fascinated with this idea of criminals, being affected by a killer like this. And would the criminals go to the police, or would they take matters into their own hands? Like, how would that play out? So I wanted to know Flo. I wanted to know Flo's acquaintances. And Ethel, my main character in 38, is, as I envision her, a friend of Flo's. She knew Flo. And so this was a big inspiration for as I was trying to craft this story. One of the things that really made me sad was looking at the political landscape and the larger things happening while this killer was operating. We were having union strikes all the time. We had this massive poverty and homelessness problem in Cleveland. And I also thought about, okay, so you have all these people living homeless in these shanty towns. Would the people who still had money feel very safe? Would they like them there? One of the consequences of this killer was that Elliot Ness burned the hobo jungles to the ground in August of 38 as a safety measure. Now, Elliot Ness was backed into a corner. He had promised the public he was going to catch this killer, and he could never catch the killer. He got so desperate at one point, he did the largest unwarranted search of private homes in the country's history. He did it under the guise of a fire inspection, and he and the fire marshal and his forces went through and tossed every tenement house, every residence they could find near downtown, especially near Central Avenue, trying to find the killer's workshop. He also kidnapped a suspect and questioned him illegally. And at the point where they found victims 11 and 12, under Elliot Ness's office window, they found these last two victims on the shores of Lake Erie. He became so outraged that the next day he took his forces and burned the hobo jungles to the ground. And here's images of what that looked like. You can see in this picture a young person kind of fleeing. The public never forgave him for that. When he tried to run for mayor later on, I think this was one of the black marks against him. The people of Cleveland saw this as a heartless move. But I saw it and I wondered, okay, so who was happy? Like, who benefited from this? And it made me wonder, you know, when the bodies were displayed, victims 1 and 2, in that very public display, if it was a message, who was that message intended for? Was it intended to be a giant go away, you know, to the hobos and prostitutes that were coming in and out on the rails? Cleveland did become a ghost town. Like, when, you know, they would ride the rails, hobos would, looking for work, and they started to ride through Cleveland. If they were coming from Baltimore, they would ride through and get off in St. Louis. They knew this killer was on the loose. So, you know, when you're looking for conspiracies, you're looking for reasons for a killer. I was like, well, you know, some people might have been happy to see the hobo jungles burned to the ground. Some people might have been happy to see fewer homeless people in Cleveland. If you look at front pages, so as I was doing my article searches and I was looking for my information, I would read the whole front page of every newspaper that had a torso killer story. And these were the kind of stories you'd read. You know, there was a lot of union unrest. The Pinkertons were still kind of around doing some union busting and breaking up strikes. There was violence in the flats. They brought in the National Guard at one point while this killer was operating. If you think about it in the context of, okay, the Bolshevik Revolution had just happened. You know, a bunch of immigrants from Russia were living in Cleveland, some that had fled the communist uprising. You've got all these homeless people massing on by the rivers. You've got workers organizing. I could see the wealthy and well-to-do Clevelanders being nervous about communism, being nervous about, you know, the poor organizing and rising up and trying to do some sort of rebellion. There was that sort of tension if you read some of the papers. Some people felt Roosevelt was a communist and was, you know, doing things, you know, against the United States Constitution. There was a real kind of tension between the factory owners and the factory workers. Does any of this sound familiar? A little bit. So I was looking at that context as well. So I did a lot of additional research into, you know, the immigrants that were coming into Cleveland. There was a huge German population. Reverend Musselman's group came from the German immigrants. The Lancaster Mennonite groups tended to come from overseas in the German area. So it was the Pennsylvania Dutch, essentially. That was where they were coming from. So if you look at Pennsylvania Dutch superstitions and their culture, it turns out there's some witchcraft in there, which is really weird if you think about hanging a horseshoe over your door or a hex sign on your barn or knocking on wood. Some of those traditions came over with the Germans, and I found that interesting. And this book is a little tiny book filled with spells. And they were like half spells, half prayers. Like if you say a prayer and then light the paper on fire, your cow's milk won't be sour, that kind of thing. I found that interesting. Oh, I gotta go back. I found this book interesting. It was all about, you know, these renegade Mennonite women that were like feminists before that was a thing. They were convinced that in a very quiet, respectful way that they could become leaders and active in their calling to help others. And I was fascinated because of all these women in this building. So, and unfortunately, we did have a group of Cleveland Nazi supporters. Not all German immigrants, but some Russian immigrants that were really concerned about communism. So as I was looking at all of these factors, I was able to cobble together a story that is based on the true facts of the case and the true facts of what was happening in Cleveland, but using fiction to fill in the gaps of what we don't know. And it was a lot of fun. This is a little brief movie that my cousin who was in the stairwell helped me film, just to give you a sense of what the book's about. So we had fun going around the building. John Stark Bellamy, who's one of the books I read, actually endorsed my novel. That was fun. So that's the story of this book and where it came from. I'm happy to answer questions, especially if you've read the book and you have a question about it. That's fine. I just ask, please, no spoilers. As for those who haven't read it, yes, you in the back.
So they really never did establish a motive of what this person was trying to do, a statement of why?
No. So the question is, did we ever find out what the motive of the torso killer was? And I think the thing that's tough, even to this day, only about 30% of homicides actually get solved in this country to this day with all of our DNA testing and all of our, data that we have, all of our technology. It's really tough to solve a stranger crime. So when I say homicides, I mean a stranger killing. So the serial killer type crimes are very difficult to solve. We've actually, right now, they're developing databases to try to link victims that may not be in the same city, that might not be in the same state, to try to find clusters of similar killings to see. They estimate that there's over 20 serial killers active today. That we have linkage blindness, like a dead body shows up here, it doesn't necessarily get linked to one that shows up another state away. So we're still working on this problem. I think one of the things that fascinates us as people about these serial killers is the fact that we really don't understand why they do what they do. The assumption back then was this was a madman, that this person was insane. And it took us as a country a really long time to get past the idea that someone's just crazy and look at behavior patterns. So when the FBI started studying Kemper and Manson and these serial killers we had in captivity, they started to understand the psychology behind a serial killer. And one of my reference books is Whoever Fights Monsters by Robert Ressler. If you've seen the show Mindhunter on Netflix, it's based on these FBI agents, and they were like stuck in the basement and like pariahs of the FBI for a long time because the idea that there would be a motive or psychology to understand was kind of a crazy idea. They just saw insanity, and why would you waste time trying to understand this more? It's just evil, and evil exists, and we should just try to snuff it out and not try to understand it. So to this day, we still struggle to understand what the motive is for these types of killings. In my novel, I do attribute a motive to all these killings, but in reality, I don't think we really know. Yes?
Why did you choose the parallel universe way of writing this with Chris and with Ethel?
Well, I love the idea. The question was, why write this story in two different time periods? So the Unclaimed Victim, very much like The Dead Key, is set up so that it's a story told in two parts. It's a story told in 1938, and it's a story told in 1999. I do that for a couple of reasons. When I'm in an old building, the sense that I get, and what I love about old buildings, is this sort of feeling of being haunted by the people that had been there. In the case of The Dead Key, I always wondered about the secretaries that worked in the spaces. Like you could kind of hear their typewriters clacking, could kind of hear them walking down the hall behind you. I've always been fascinated about the people that had been there. So I want to know about those people. I wanted to know about the Mennonite women. I wanted to know about the people that were in and out of this crazy building. But I also wanted to tie it to present day because it's relevant today. This building is still there. And I love the idea of someone coming through in '99 when Chris Wiley's living on Thurman Avenue next to this abandoned factory. She wants to know who's living in there. She ends up walking through this now decrepit, falling apart, leaky building. And I like the idea that you're haunted by the past in the present, and that the past and the present can be mirror images of each other. I think one of the things that fascinated me about writing The Unclaimed Victim was just how many parallels between the political climate back in the 30s, in the time of the Great Depression, versus the political climate now. You know, there's this fear of immigrants, there's this fear of the poor, there is a concern or a conflict between what the government should do and what it should not do. Should workers be able to unionize or not? These questions were very much questions back then. We were on the precipice of a world war. Discrimination was becoming a bigger issue. So it was just, I find it fascinating to look at the past through the prism of the present and see how, I also like kind of playing the two storylines off of each other, because I love the idea my two characters can walk down the same hallway several decades apart, and you get to see them at both times. Yes?
When you write like that, do you write all of one character and then all of the other, or do you write them at the same time?
The question is, do I write one time period all at once and then go to the next time period, or do I go back and forth? My process is evolving each time I write a book. I just finished one. My fourth book is in right now to my agent. And I actually finally, for the first time, I was so confused about how I would weave it all together that I did write the separate time periods separately. And then I had to marry it all together. For me, in writing, The Dead Key was my baby, like the first time I ever tried doing this. And what I liked about going back and forth is I would get stumped. After 3 chapters, I would get stumped on what would happen next. I'd be like, okay, I have no idea. So I'm going to set that aside, and I'm going to work on something else for a little bit. So I would jump back to the other time period and work on that for a bit. And what I found was taking a few days off from one storyline to spend on another, all the question marks and the things that I wasn't sure where the direction of the story was going, because I don't outline because I'm insane. But I kind of just let my characters sort of run around and make bad choices, and then I see what happens. But I just found that rhythm really helped me. It gave me a break, and I would always figure out a way to solve a plot problem in one time period by working on the other one. And so what I found was that I was very comfortable with that kind of rhythm. It doesn't usually stay exactly the way I write it. My first draft does not look like my last draft at all. A lot of times I'll take out whole sections and kind of move things around. But I kind of like the idea, again, with that echo and mirror effect of the two time periods. My mood and the action and the level of what's happening in one time period definitely gets reflected in the next 3 chapters that come along. So I find a lot of inspiration. It keeps me motivated, and it keeps me interested. Plus, I mean, this third book wasn't as much of a problem, but Iris Latch and The Dead Key, I couldn't do her all the time. Like I could hang out with her for a while, then I needed a break. It's like hanging out with your teenage self. Like it's fun for a minute, and then you have to, get away. So for me, it was a nice breather from the characters and their flaws as well. Is there another question? Yes?
So ironically, I just went to the Cleveland History Museum and saw the postcards. Did you see the postcards sent to Elliot Ness?
Yes. The question is, so in the Cleveland Museum, Police Museum archive, there are postcards that supposedly came from Dr. Francis Sweeney, and they were sent to Elliot Ness years later. I mean, I think one was like postmarked from the 40s or like the 50s. And so the idea, because of the way it was initialed at the bottom, a lot of historians believe that those postcards were sent to Elliot Ness from Dr. Francis Sweeney. And some say that's evidence that Sweeney was the killer and he was taunting Ness the way some serial killers have done to police officers in more modern times. My only quibble, and I had to have coffee with Jim Bedell when I was done with this book, and I knew he would disagree with some of the things I'd done, so I bought him a coffee and I'm like, okay, this is my theory. So my quibble with the idea that this proves it was Dr. Sweeney is that Dr. Sweeney got kidnapped by Elliot Ness. If you believe he was the mystery suspect. He got kidnapped, he was drunk, he got kidnapped and held prisoner for several days in the Renaissance Hotel. He was given experimental lie detector tests, he was interrogated. After that experience, I would say that Dr. Francis Sweeney had some reasons to mess with Ness. Maybe a little bit of a vendetta. I would be kind of annoyed if someone had kidnapped me and threatened my life and freedom and said I was going to be locked up forever and then could never make a case. One of the things that's interesting, some of the evidence suggests that victims 11 and 12 were embalmed, which means that they weren't actually murdered, they were stolen from a funeral home. These were the victims that were found under Elliot Ness's window. And so they also were found, so Dr. Francis Sweeney got kidnapped in May of 1938. Victims 11 and 12 were found in August of 1938. So it's like, I just got kidnapped, I got released, I want to mess with Ness, so I might steal a couple bodies. There's evidence that Dr. Francis Sweeney's office was across the street from a morgue. So maybe I steal a couple bodies, hack them up, and throw them under Elliot Ness's window just to give him a little. So I think that's a plausible explanation for why Sweeney might have been messing with Ness. I'm not saying that's a definitive reason. I'm just saying there's a motive there. I could make that case in court that he had a motive to mess with Ness because Ness had basically kidnapped him. So yes, there is, I think of all the suspects that have been considered as the torso killer, Dr. Francis Sweeney is generally accepted as the most likely. But again, I have my doubts. Could one drunk, morphined up doctor carry two, full-grown men down a steep hill without dragging the bodies and do all this stuff without being seen? Like that I think is an interesting trick. So I've got my doubts that he's actually the actual killer. I did have fun in this book kind of laying out for you, the reader, all the different suspects that have been considered over the years. If you go to torsokillers.com, that's actually a real website, it'll take you to my Amazon page. But I love the idea of this serial killer, these tourists, or like these people that study serial killers. I don't want to call them groupies because I think that's too flippant, but there are people fascinated with serial killers. There are amateur detectives that are working on this case right now. And I love the idea of introducing that concept to this story, that there are many theories about who this killer was. And in 1999, while Chris Wiley is dealing with a modern day murder that looks like the torso killer did it, and she's trying to figure out what the heck is going on and why her father has all these books on the torso killer. I like the idea that she has to weed through not only the evidence from today, but all the theories and all the books and all the different things that have been written because the crime was committed so long ago. So that was a fun way to tell the story. Yes?
What were the thoughts as to why the murders stopped?
Right, so the murders suddenly stopped. And the question is, what were the thoughts about why the murders stopped? Some people say Francis Sweeney was incarcerated for a period of time, and that's the reason why they stopped, although he did not die, I think, until the 50s. One of the reasons why the killing stopped is because Coroner Gerber stopped ruling certain deaths as related to the torso killer. I mean, there were some bodies found in the 40s in Pennsylvania that looked very similar. Now, I'm not a medical examiner. I can't tell you all the reasons why they were ruled out. There was a body found in Cleveland in 1950, decapitated and emasculated under some steel beams in a steel yard. And again, it looked like something the serial killer, the torso killer could have done. So some would argue that they didn't stop. Peter Merlo, the lead detective, who kind of became like the case that drove him kind of crazy all his career, even into his retirement, he believed there were over 50 victims. There were victims they found in Pennsylvania, there were victims they found in New York, there were victims up in Canada. So it's possible that the killer just moved on. It's possible that the killer got better at hiding the bodies. That's another thing. If we hadn't found the human remains, we never would have known about these victims at all. They were never identified. They were never reported missing. If they hadn't found an arm or a leg washed up on the beach, no one would have ever known that these people existed. So that also then lends itself to the conclusion that maybe there were many more victims that were never found, which is, a sad but real thought. That's what could be true. So, yes?
Was there any theory as to why the first two were so publicly displayed and then the other ones are?
The question is, was there any theory as to why the first two victims were publicly displayed? I did not read, in most of the books, theories about that. John Stark Bellamy II, who writes these really sensational true crime books like The Corpse in the Cellar and They Died Crawling, and the book The Maniac in the Bushes was up for a minute because that's the book where he covers the torso killer. And John Stark Bellamy II, he is the grandson of John Bellamy, who was a reporter at the Plain Dealer at the time of the torso killings. That was his grandfather. And John says in his book that his grandfather felt that those were mob killings and that this whole torso killer boogeyman was drummed up mostly by the press to sell papers. So there was a strong theory among some people, and boy did they sell papers, by the way. I mean, they were putting out morning and evening editions back then. There were 2 papers in town, and it was sensational, headline-grabbing stuff whenever the torso killer would strike. So there were some theories that it was a different sort of killing. I would argue, Eddie Andrassy, there was so many people that wanted him dead. Like, he apparently assaulted some officer's wife, like pretending to be a gynecologist. Like, he was a gambler, he messed in the mob, he was a hustler, he was a pimp. Like, he was so deep in the underworld, like you could probably fill a phone book with people that wanted him dead. Nobody knows who the other guy was, this older gentleman that was found next to him, victim number 2. Never identified, no idea who he was. So I don't know that it's widely accepted that it was a mob killing, because the work was so neat, and I mean, they were beheaded when they were alive, and there was no blood found on the scene. So there was something very almost meticulous about the way these bodies were, about the way these people were killed. And I question why you would leave some bodies out like as a showpiece and almost like be ashamed of the other ones. Like Flo Polillo was found in a basket behind a warehouse. People, I mean, the dog was barking at it in the middle of the cold winter, and they thought it was, discarded butcher meat when they first found her remains. So that was not ceremonious or grand. Certainly not trying to make an example of her, but somebody sure was trying to make an example of Eddie. So it's anybody's guess, but I thought it was odd. It was one of the things that hooked me into studying it more, because when you look at all the data, some of it just doesn't match up. Yes.
I think earlier you said that you thought that there was more than one killer, possibly.
Yes, well, there was evidence.
Does that play into that these are all different?
Yes, I do believe that there could have been more than one killer. John Stark Bellamy believes that these weren't not all of the work of the same killer. One body in particular, I believe it was victim number 9 or 7. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to look at my notes. But it was a woman's body found in the river. And there were 2 different styles of knife marks on the body. One was very surgical, and one was very erratic. And Coroner Gerber decided that the killer was just upset. Even though the killer was just getting angry or was upset, and it was still the same killer, even though it looked like 2 distinct people involved. And when I saw that evidence, there was some question about an apprentice, like was there somebody else involved? And of course, every writer under the sun that's written about this has all these wild theories out. You write about it in your books, and you can see people saying, was there an apprentice? But when I looked at that, it kind of made me start to think, okay, maybe there was more than one killer. And who wanted this killer to be around? I mean, there was all kinds of political ramifications of this. Mayor Burton was under a ton of pressure. The sheriff, they arrested the wrong man. I mean, Frank Dolezal I don't go into this in the book, but a man that knew Flo Polillo was arrested by the county, the sheriff's office, and they beat a confession out of him. And many accounts believe they killed him because he was found hanging from a rope that was 1 inch too long to actually hang him, and he had a bunch of broken ribs. So there was a lot of desperation on a lot of people's behalf. I mean, the political climate was really almost rabid by the time the 5th victim showed up. People were outraged and terrified that we hadn't found this victim. So it made the mayor look bad. It made the police force look bad. It was a political hot potato as well. And so if you look at that from a cynical point of view, it's like, okay, so who was happy? Who might have wanted this? And I'm not saying that that's what the conclusion was, but these are the questions I was asking as I was looking through all these papers and the details of the crimes. I think we've got time. We're after 8 o'clock, so we got time for one more question. Well, you guys already asked one. Someone new? Anyone? Okay, ladies first.
I have to say I was bothered by how strung out Chris was and Iris from the Vicky.
Yes.
In terms of eating, sleeping, brushing their teeth, getting a shower, is that to parallel what they're going through? Is it kind of, the harrowing situations they're dealing with?
Yeah.
I mean, it was it was distracting enough where I was like, did she eat?
Oh, I could tell you're a mom. I love that. So this question is, was it intentional that it was almost distracting as a reader how distraught and disheveled and freaked out Iris was in The Dead Key and Chris in this Unclaimed Victim book? And was it intentional? So this is the challenge, I think, for me writing. I love the stories like Agatha Christie writes, where you have like the very cool, calm, collected Miss Marple, or someone who's just like, all right, so we're gonna find the answer here, as opposed to somebody like Chris, whose father has just vanished, and they believe he's been killed and cut up into pieces. So I'm trying to maintain the realism of, okay, if it was me, or Chris was based more on someone I know, but like, would you be calm, cool, and collected if your father was sitting in a morgue? And how would you really behave? And the few times I've had trauma in my life where there's been a major issue or some major problem, you forget to eat, you can't sleep. I'm kind of a wreck. I drink too much. Like I'm not making good decisions at all. So it's and you're like, you want to make sure she ate. Yeah, so no, she's not in good shape. Both of my characters kind of struggle in these situations. And I don't know what it is about me, but I see my modern characters as a little bit more frazzled than my historical characters for some reason. But I think that there is a difference in attitude. I mean, I honestly, a modern day person like Chris, who, went to public school and didn't have to work in the farm when she was 8 years old, driving tractors when she's 10. She wasn't driving a truck to go pick up a live chicken. The things that like Ethel Harding went through, her alcoholic father, mother's dead, in the middle of the Great Depression, she's 14 years old trying to feed her baby brother. Those circumstances that happen that young, to these, especially these historical characters, all my characters have had a hard life, unfortunately. But I feel like you get a little hardened and you're a little bit more used to the kind of trauma crisis mode of, being in danger, or being abandoned, or having some major, being in danger is a big one. Finding a dead body, finding a dead body. I'm trying to think, okay, would I be like, all right, well, is he wearing his shoes? Does he have his pipe? I bet you that one sock doesn't match the other. I mean, like, I'm not gonna be able to do the kind of like, Professor Perot kind of, or Inspector Perot kind of like investigative work. I'm screaming around, there's a dead body, and I'm throwing up everywhere. That's me. But so I kind of try to take this from a more average person in a very remarkable circumstance and what they would look like and how they would handle it. For me, it's tough. I mean, I've got to get my husband to believe this could actually happen. Whenever I'm writing anything, like if he doesn't buy it, I'm like, oh crap, okay, I got to keep going. He's like, wouldn't she be upset? She's just going to drive and then coldly start reading manuals. I'm like, no, she's probably not. So it's tough. I think it's tough to maintain a sense of realism, but also serve the story. And I think that's the balancing act that I try to walk every time I write a book, because as readers, we want characters that can figure stuff out. We want characters that don't drive us nuts, and we want endings that feel satisfying. And I think that we can all agree that life just doesn't work that way. So which is one of the reasons why we love these books, right? So something can finally turn out right. What I'm trying to do is strike a balance between what feels real to me and what's satisfying for you as the reader. So if she drove you nuts, I'm sorry. Well, if you were worried about her, that's good. I think one of the things that you're trying to do when you're writing is to create characters that you care about. So if you were worried whether or not she ate, then I'm glad you cared about Chris. Thank you all very much for your time. Thank you. I will be in the back. I'm happy to answer your questions one-on-one. If you're not interested in buying a book today, please pick up a bookmark. You can see my website, my email. You can follow me on Facebook or Twitter and hear about my fourth book and when it's coming out. So thank you so much.
Thanks to the management and staff of the Hudson Library and Historical Society for their assistance in the production of this program and for providing the 2018 Author Series for the citizens of Hudson. Follow DM Pulley on Amazon, Facebook, and Twitter, or visit her website at dmpulley.com.